What if the reason life feels unfinished is because it actually is? What if this world, this fragile body, these fading memories, this slow passage of time, is not the destination, but the introduction? What if everything you've ever known is only the tutorial level, and death is not an ending, but the moment the real experience finally begins? From the moment you were born, something has felt slightly off. Not wrong, just incomplete, as if you were dropped into the middle of a story without context. You wake up each day inside a body you didn't design, in a world whose rules you never agreed to, surrounded by people who are just as confused as you are, all pretending they understand what's happening. And yet, beneath the routines, beneath the noise, there's a quiet intuition that this is not the full version of existence, that something bigger is waiting, something withheld. Think about how strangely limited human life is. Your senses only register a tiny fraction of reality. You see less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum. You hear only a narrow band of vibrations. Time moves forward at a fixed pace you cannot control. Your memory resets at birth, erasing whatever came before. Your body decays just as you begin to understand it. And right when wisdom starts to form, when patterns begin to make sense, death arrives and pulls the plug. Does that feel like a final design or a deliberate constraint? In physics, constraints are never meaningless. They exist to stabilize systems, to guide outcomes, to prevent collapse. In simulations, limitations are intentional. You restrict abilities at the start so the player learns gradually. You lock advanced mechanics until the fundamentals are mastered. You allow mistakes, repetition, failure, because learning requires friction. A perfect environment teaches nothing. Only resistance creates growth. So why would consciousness, something so complex it can reflect on its own existence, be placed inside such a narrow channel? Why would awareness be trapped inside fragile biology, limited perception, emotional volatility, and constant uncertainty? Why does reality feel like it's holding back information? Why do answers always seem just out of reach? Consider how often life resembles training rather than fulfillment. You struggle, adapt, fail, learn, repeat. Relationships test your emotional intelligence. Loss sharpens empathy. Fear forces courage into existence. Pain carves depth into understanding. And none of it feels optional. You don't choose the challenges, you respond to them. As if the environment is calibrated specifically to pressure your consciousness into development. Even childhood reflects this pattern. You arrive knowing nothing. Language must be learned. Balance must be learned. Identity must be assembled piece by piece. And as you grow older, the sense of novelty fades. Memory blurs. The early years dissolve into abstraction. It's almost as if the system slowly erases the initial loading screen, so you stop questioning where you came from. And yet, moments slip through the cracks. Déjà vu. The feeling that you've been here before. The sudden sense that time folded in on itself. The unexplainable familiarity of strangers. Near-death experiences where people report clarity rather than fear. Life reviews where meaning becomes obvious in an instant. Children who speak of places and lives they were never supposed to know. These aren't proof, but they are anomalies. And anomalies are where deeper truths hide. Modern neuroscience tells us that consciousness is filtered, not generated. The brain doesn't show us reality as it is. It shows us what it thinks we need to survive. Evolution favors efficiency, not truth. You don't see reality, you see a compressed interface. Just enough information to function. Just enough awareness to act. Like a simplified HUD in a game that hides the complexity of the underlying system. If that's true, then what happens when the interface shuts down? When the body fails, the brain dissolves, and sensory input collapses? Does consciousness vanish? Or does the filter lift? Physics already tells us something unsettling. Information cannot be destroyed. At the quantum level, everything that exists leaves a trace. Energy transforms, but it does not disappear. The particles that form your body were forged in stars billions of years ago. They've been recycled through countless forms. If matter persists, why would consciousness, arguably the most structured phenomenon we know, be the one exception? Maybe death isn't annihilation. Maybe it's declassification. In every training environment, there comes a moment when the rules change, when the safety barriers drop, when the learner is trusted with more freedom. Maybe this life is not meant to feel complete. Maybe confusion is a feature, not a flaw. Maybe the constant sense that something is missing is the system nudging you forward. Notice how humans obsess over progress, levels, achievements, growth. Even when survival is secured, we search for meaning. We invent goals. We climb hierarchies. We crave transcendence. It's as if consciousness itself is uncomfortable staying still, as if it knows stagnation is failure. And notice how death is framed, not as a transition, but as a terror, something unspeakable, something to avoid thinking about, almost as if fear is the final barrier of the tutorial, the last test before advancement. Because once fear dissolves, control dissolves with it. Imagine a tutorial where the player must forget their training in order for the lesson to work. Imagine an environment so immersive that the learner believes it is reality itself. Only then do choices carry weight. Only then does suffering teach. Only then does kindness matter. If you knew with certainty that this wasn't the final state, would you act differently? Would you cling less? Would you forgive more easily? Would you pay closer attention to how you shape your inner world? Maybe that's why certainty is withheld. The universe doesn't confirm or deny, it stays silent. Like a teacher watching quietly, allowing you to reveal who you are under pressure. Not by what you believe, but by how you respond when you don't know. So ask yourself this, slowly, honestly, without reaching for comfort. If this life were only preparation, what would it be preparing you for? If death were not an end but a threshold, what kind of consciousness would you want to carry across it? And if this truly is the tutorial, are you learning or just passing time? Why does consciousness feel so restrained, as if it's running on low power mode? Why does the mind, capable of imagining infinity, feel trapped inside a skull, barely wide enough to hold its own thoughts? And why does awareness itself seem to strain against invisible limits, like something vast compressed into something painfully small? If this life is a tutorial, then the weakness of human consciousness is not accidental, it is instructional. Look closely at your own awareness. You cannot hold too much at once. Attention fractures easily. Memory decays. Emotions hijack logic. The mind forgets lessons it swore it would never forget. You repeat mistakes even after understanding them. Insight arrives late, often only after damage is done. It feels inefficient, almost cruel. But inefficiency is exactly how training environments work. You don't begin with mastery. You begin with restriction. Neuroscience tells us the brain filters reality aggressively. At any moment, your senses are bombarded with millions of bits of information per second. Yet, your conscious awareness receives only a tiny fraction. Most of reality is discarded before you ever notice it. Not because it doesn't exist, but because you couldn't function if you perceived it all. Consciousness, as experienced by humans, is not raw perception. It is a narrowed stream, curated for survival. You don't see reality. You see a survival-oriented summary. This means your awareness is not the maximum possible version of itself. It is a throttled version. A version optimized for learning under pressure, not for comprehension of the whole. Consider how limited your perception truly is. You cannot see infrared or ultraviolet. You cannot hear most frequencies. You cannot feel magnetic fields, even though they pass through you constantly. You experience time in one direction only, even though physics allows far stranger possibilities. You are locked into a single point of view, unable to step outside yourself and observe the full structure of existence. If consciousness were meant to be complete here, these limitations would make no sense. But if consciousness is meant to be trained here, they make perfect sense. In every complex system, you isolate variables to prevent overload. You teach fundamentals before exposing higher dimensions. You don't hand a beginner infinite tools. You give them just enough to struggle productively. Confusion is not a sign of failure. It is the pressure that forces growth. Human consciousness is underpowered because overpowering it would collapse the lesson. Think about how overwhelming even small expansions of awareness can be. A single traumatic experience can shatter identity. A sudden insight can destabilize a life. Psychedelic states, which temporarily loosen perceptual filters, often feel more real than reality itself. And yet, most people cannot integrate them without confusion, fear, or fragmentation. This suggests that expanded consciousness is not inherently safe. It requires preparation. So, the limits you feel, the mental fog, the emotional volatility, the forgetfulness, may not be defects. They may be safety rails. Even intelligence follows this pattern. Humans are intelligent enough to ask questions about existence, but not intelligent enough to definitively answer them. Smart enough to sense mystery, but not smart enough to dissolve it. Always reaching, never arriving. This tension keeps the mind active, curious, searching. If answers were obvious, awareness would stagnate. And notice how consciousness develops over time. A newborn is barely self-aware. Identity forms slowly. Empathy must be learned. Perspective-taking must be practiced. Moral reasoning evolves through error. Wisdom does not arrive with knowledge. It arrives with experience, often painful experience. This is not how an end-state consciousness behaves. This is how a developing one behaves. It is how something incomplete behaves. There is also something deeply strange about how consciousness handles suffering. The mind resists pain, yet pain is one of the most powerful catalysts for transformation. People rarely change when life is comfortable. Growth accelerates under pressure. Loss deepens empathy. Failure sharpens self-awareness. Fear exposes values. This suggests that consciousness is not optimized for happiness. It is optimized for learning. Why would a final form require such harsh lessons? It wouldn't, but a training form would. Imagine trying to compress vast awareness into biological hardware. You would need limits. You would need emotional feedback systems. You would need mortality to enforce urgency. You would need uncertainty to force choice. You would need ignorance so discovery feels earned. And you would need forgetting. Forgetting is one of the most misunderstood aspects of consciousness. Memory loss feels like decay, but it may be regulation. You forget details so patterns can emerge. You forget pain so life can continue. You forget childhood so identity can evolve. Forgetting is how consciousness sheds outdated models to make room for new ones. If you remembered everything perfectly, you would be paralyzed. And yet, forgetting also ensures you never fully understand what you're part of. It keeps the larger structure hidden, which raises a disturbing possibility that remembering too much too soon would break the tutorial. There are moments when the limits flicker, extreme stress, deep meditation, near-death experiences. People report expanded awareness, panoramic memory, a sense of being more themselves than ever before, not confused, not fragmented, clear, calm, as if the mind briefly accessed a higher bandwidth. What's striking is that these experiences often feel less like hallucinations and more like removals, like something was taken away rather than added, as if the normal filters were lifted for a moment. If consciousness can expand when constraints loosen, then its everyday limitations are not intrinsic. They are imposed, and imposed limits imply purpose. Consider how often people describe life as exhausting. Consciousness feels heavy here. Maintaining identity takes effort. Emotions drain energy. Attention fades. It's as if awareness is operating in a dense medium, like moving through water rather than air. Resistance everywhere. Nothing flows freely for long. What if that density is intentional? What if this environment is designed to slow consciousness down, to force it to grapple with complexity one step at a time? What if ease would ruin the lesson? In advanced systems, you don't train in perfect conditions. You train in resistance. You add friction so strength develops. You add delay so patience forms. You add uncertainty so adaptability emerges. Human consciousness feels underpowered because overpowering it would bypass growth. And there is something else, quieter, more unsettling. If this is not the final form of consciousness, then death would not erase awareness. It would release it from its constraints. The end of biological limits would not be the end of experience, but the end of restriction. Not disappearance, but expansion. Which means the fear of death may not be fear of nothingness. It may be fear of losing the only form you've learned to identify with. The tutorial does not tell you what comes next. It only prepares you to face it. And preparation does not feel like completion. It feels like struggle. It feels like being unfinished. It feels like knowing something is missing without knowing what it is. That feeling you've had your entire life, that something about existence is slightly muted, slightly constrained, slightly withheld, may not be dissatisfaction. It may be calibration. Why would a tutorial include pain at all? Why wouldn't a training ground for consciousness be gentle, reassuring, safe? Why would existence be structured around loss, fear, grief, illness, betrayal, and the slow erosion of everything we grow attached to? If this life were meant to be paradise, suffering would be a design flaw. But if this life is meant to shape something unfinished, suffering becomes the core mechanic. Pain does something that comfort never can. It forces attention. It collapses illusions. It strips away stories you tell yourself about who you are and exposes what remains when control is gone. Pleasure soothes consciousness, but suffering carves it, and carving implies intention. Look at how deeply pain reorganizes the mind. A single traumatic moment can permanently alter perception, values, priorities, even identity itself. Entire belief systems collapse under enough pressure. People emerge from grief changed at a structural level, more sensitive, more fragile, yet often more compassionate and aware. This is not random damage. This is transformation through stress. In physics, stress reveals structure. Materials only show their true properties when pushed to their limits. In psychology, it's the same. You do not discover who you are in ease. You discover who you are when something you love is threatened or lost. If consciousness were already complete, pain would be unnecessary. But if consciousness is still forming, still being shaped, then pain becomes a tool. Brutal, yes, but precise. Notice how suffering is calibrated. Too much, and a person breaks completely. Too little, and nothing changes. Most lives exist in an unstable balance. Enough pain to challenge, rarely enough to fully destroy. As if the system is constantly adjusting difficulty, pushing just hard enough to provoke growth without erasing the learner. This is unsettling because it implies that suffering is not accidental. It suggests that pain is not merely tolerated by reality, but allowed, perhaps even required. Think about how suffering teaches lessons that logic alone cannot. You can intellectually understand impermanence, but only loss makes it real. You can read about empathy, but only pain opens it fully. You can study morality, but only temptation and consequence give it weight. Pain compresses meaning into consciousness in a way nothing else does. And look at how universally this applies. No one escapes it. Wealth does not protect you. Intelligence does not exempt you. Virtue does not grant immunity. Suffering is the one experience guaranteed to every human being. If this were a meaningless flaw, it would be strangely consistent. But if it were curriculum, its universality would make perfect sense. Even the body participates in this lesson. It is fragile by design. It breaks, heals, scars, and weakens. It constantly reminds consciousness of limits. Illness interrupts plans. Aging humbles ambition. Physical vulnerability enforces dependence on others. Through the body, consciousness learns humility, patience, and care. A permanent body would freeze development. A fragile one forces adaptation. And then there is emotional suffering, the most precise instrument of all. Loneliness, rejection, shame, regret. These pains target the sense of self directly. They force introspection. They question identity. They ask relentlessly who you are beneath your roles and defenses. Why would a final state of existence require such brutal introspection? It wouldn't, but a preparatory state would. Many philosophies arrive at this conclusion independently. Buddhism frames suffering as the engine of awakening. Stoicism treats hardship as training. Existentialism sees meaning as forged under pressure. Even evolutionary biology shows that complexity arises through stress, not comfort. Systems grow stronger by surviving difficulty, not avoiding it. This pattern repeats at every scale. Stars are born through gravitational collapse. Elements are forged in stellar death. Planets emerge from chaos. Life evolves through extinction events. Growth follows breakdown. Creation follows destruction. Why would consciousness be exempt from the universe's most consistent rule? Yet something even darker emerges when you look closely. Suffering does not just teach, it selects. Some people awaken through pain. Others shut down, some expand, others contract. The same event can deepen one person and hollow out another. This suggests that suffering is not just instruction, it is assessment. Not everyone responds the same way. Not everyone integrates the lesson. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility, that the tutorial is not merely about enduring pain, but about how you metabolize it. Whether you turn suffering into awareness or into numbness, whether pain opens you or hardens you, this reframes moral development entirely. Kindness, patience, forgiveness. These are not just virtues. They may be survival traits for consciousness under pressure, ways of processing pain without fragmenting. Notice how people who avoid pain at all costs often remain shallow, reactive, easily destabilized. Comfort becomes a sedative. Distraction becomes an escape hatch. Growth stalls. Meanwhile, those who face pain consciously often develop depth that feels almost disproportionate, as if something inside them expanded to hold the weight. It is tempting to call this unfair, and it is. But training rarely feels fair to the trainee. The weights do not care how tired you are. Gravity does not negotiate. The system applies pressure regardless of preference. What matters is adaptation, and there is something else hidden inside suffering. Urgency. Mortality plus pain creates stakes. It forces decisions. It compresses time. Without suffering, life would blur. Days would lose edge. Choices would lose consequence. Meaning would diffuse into nothing. Pain sharpens focus. If this life were endless and painless, you would never need to decide who you are, which suggests that pain is not here to punish consciousness, but to force it to define itself. Every response to suffering is a declaration. Every act of compassion under pressure is a signal. Every choice to remain conscious rather than numb is data. If this is a tutorial, then suffering is how the system finds out what kind of awareness you are becoming. This does not make suffering good. It makes it purposeful. And purpose is far more unsettling than randomness, because randomness can be ignored. Purpose demands response. And now comes the most disturbing thought of all. If suffering is curriculum, then avoiding it entirely may mean failing to learn what this environment is designed to teach. Not by being harmed, but by being disengaged. If that idea feels uncomfortable, it should. Tutorials are not meant to be comfortable. They are meant to prepare you for something that will not be. So ask yourself, quietly, honestly, without romance or despair, what has your suffering changed in you? Did it shrink you or stretch you? Did it close you or deepen you? Because if this life is training consciousness for something beyond it, then pain is not the enemy. Unconsciousness is. If suffering is the curriculum, then forgetting is the lock that keeps the lesson intact. And that raises a question far more unsettling than pain itself. Why don't you remember where you came from? Why does consciousness arrive in this world wiped clean, stripped of context, history, and prior identity? Why do your earliest years dissolve into fog? Why does memory fracture so easily, decay so quietly, betray you without warning? Why does life feel like a story that begins in the middle, with no opening chapter and no explanation of the rules? If this existence were the final destination, memory loss would be a catastrophic flaw. But if this existence is a tutorial, forgetting becomes essential. Imagine trying to learn anything while already knowing the outcome. Imagine playing a game where all levels are unlocked, all secrets revealed, all consequences neutralized by foresight. Nothing would matter. Choices would lose weight. Fear would evaporate. Growth would stall. The lesson would collapse under too much information. Forgetting is not absence, it is containment. Neuroscience already supports this in fragments. The brain is not a storage device, it is a selective editor. Memory is reconstructed, not retrieved. Details are discarded constantly, not because they are unimportant, but because retaining everything would overwhelm cognition. The mind preserves narrative coherence, not accuracy. It keeps what helps identity function, and releases what destabilizes it. This suggests that memory loss is not passive decay. It is active regulation. Now, consider how extreme this regulation is. You do not remember your birth. You do not remember before birth. You do not remember choosing this life, this body, this era. Your earliest sense of self appears suddenly, as if consciousness snapped into focus halfway through a process already in motion. That should feel strange. We have normalized it, but it is profoundly unnatural. In every other system, loss of memory is considered damage. In consciousness, it is universal. And yet, the cracks appear. Children who speak of lives they were never supposed to live. Specific names, locations, relationships, deaths, sometimes verified later. People who, under hypnosis or near death, report memories that do not feel imagined, but recovered. Moments of déjà vu so powerful they feel like re-entry rather than coincidence. Dreams that carry emotional familiarity without narrative explanation. These experiences are rare, inconsistent, and dismissed easily, which is exactly what you would expect if memory were not meant to persist here. If recollection were a breach, not a feature. Even near-death experiences follow a pattern. People do not report confusion. They report clarity, a sense of remembering rather than discovering, a panoramic awareness where life events are not just recalled, but understood from multiple perspectives simultaneously. As if memory, once freed from biological constraints, becomes multidimensional. What's telling is not what people see, but what they feel. A sense of coming back rather than going somewhere new. If consciousness were created at birth, there would be nothing to remember. So why does remembering feel like recovery? In training environments, memory is often restricted to preserve immersion. The learner must believe the scenario is real for it to work. If you knew you were training, your emotional responses would flatten. Fear would feel artificial. Love would feel provisional. Suffering would lose its edge. The lesson would fail. Which brings us to a disturbing possibility, that forgetting is the price of authenticity. That awareness must be limited, isolated, and contextualized inside a temporary identity to develop certain qualities at all. Think about how identity works. You are not just consciousness, you are personality, history, attachment, fear, desire. These layers create friction. They generate conflict. They force choices. If you remembered being something vast, eternal, unbounded, how seriously would you take a fragile human life? Probably not enough. So memory is sealed. Identity is narrowed. Perspective is reduced to a single point in space and time, and consciousness is asked to grow anyway. This is not how an end state operates. This is how an incubator operates. Notice how memory returns only when identity loosens. Deep meditation, psychedelic states, extreme stress, near death. The more the ego dissolves, the more expansive awareness becomes, as if identity itself is the lock, and letting go is the key. But the lock re-engages quickly. The system does not tolerate prolonged access. Because access is not the goal, integration is. You are not here to remember everything. You are here to become something. And what you become must be forged without the advantage of knowing why you are here. That ignorance forces sincerity. It forces real struggle. It forces meaning to be earned rather than inherited, which reframes life's most frustrating quality, the constant sense of almost understanding, of knowing there is something just beyond reach, of standing on the edge of insight, unable to step over. That is not failure. That is the boundary condition. The tutorial does not reveal the full map. It only shows you the next step. And memory is withheld not to punish you, but to prevent contamination. To ensure that whatever emerges from this life is shaped by lived experience, not borrowed certainty. If consciousness were allowed to remember its origin fully, this environment would collapse into theater. Nothing would hurt deeply enough. Nothing would matter long enough. Growth would be simulated, not real. So the system does something ruthless. It makes you forget who you are, so you can discover who you become. And that discovery only has value if it happens under pressure, uncertainty, and time. Which brings us to the most unsettling thought yet. If forgetting is part of the design, then remembering may come later. Not here, not now, but after the lesson is complete. And if that is true, then death is not where memory ends. It is where memory unlocks. So ask yourself, not with hope, not with fear, but with clarity. If one day everything you forgot were returned to you, what kind of consciousness would you want to remember having been? Because whatever comes next will not ask what you believed, it will reveal what you became. Why does time feel so rigid here, yet so unstable inside you? Why do minutes stretch endlessly during pain, yet years vanish in memory like mist? Why does time feel less like a law of reality, and more like a pressure system, slowly squeezing consciousness forward, whether it's ready or not? If this life is a tutorial, then time is not the background. Time is the pacing mechanism. Physics already tells us something deeply unsettling. Time is not absolute. Einstein showed that it bends, slows, and accelerates, depending on motion and gravity. Two observers can experience different amounts of time and still both be correct. At the quantum level, time behaves even more strangely, sometimes appearing irrelevant, sometimes reversible, sometimes non-existent, which means the way you experience time is not how time actually is. What you feel is not reality. It is an interface. Your consciousness moves through time 1 second at a time, locked into a forward-only sequence. You cannot rewind. You cannot pause. You cannot skip ahead. You are forced to experience moments in order, absorbing consequences before understanding them. This alone should raise suspicion, because in most systems, linear progression is used to teach causality. You learn by watching actions unfold. You learn by seeing outcomes you can't undo. You learn because time does not wait. If time were fluid to you, if you could jump backward, undo mistakes, or preview consequences, growth would lose its edge. Regret would dissolve. Responsibility would weaken. Choice would lose gravity. Time creates stakes. Notice how your most important lessons arrive too late. You understand relationships only after losing them. You appreciate health only after damage. You grasp meaning only after waste. Wisdom lags behind action like a shadow that always follows but never leads. This is not inefficiency. It is design. In a training environment, insight must arrive after experience, not before, or the lesson fails. Time enforces this order mercilessly. It ensures that consciousness feels consequence before comprehension, and then there is aging. Your body decays gradually, predictably, irreversibly. This decay is not subtle, it is relentless. Wrinkles appear, energy fades, memory softens. Time marks you visibly, forcing awareness of impermanence long before death arrives. If this world were meant to be inhabited indefinitely, aging would be nonsensical. But if this world is meant to be temporary, aging becomes the countdown timer. Not to threaten you, to focus you. Urgency sharpens perception. When time feels infinite, attention blurs. When time feels scarce, meaning condenses. Mortality forces prioritization. It asks consciousness a brutal question over and over again. What matters enough to spend this moment on? Time pressure reveals values more honestly than any philosophy. And look at how consciousness behaves near the edges of time. In accidents, seconds stretch into eternity. During love, hours vanish unnoticed. In trauma, moments replay endlessly. In meditation, time dissolves. In near-death experiences, people report timelessness, an absence of sequence entirely. These are not random distortions. They are glimpses of what consciousness feels like when time loosens its grip. If consciousness were native to linear time, these experiences would be impossible. The fact that awareness can step outside time, even briefly, suggests that time is not fundamental to it, which implies that time is not where consciousness belongs. Time may be the container, not the source. Imagine trying to train something vast, multidimensional, and unbounded. You would need to slow it down. You would need to force it into sequence. You would need to compress eternity into moments so lessons could land. Time would not be the enemy of consciousness. It would be the leash, and that leash would only be necessary temporarily. In physics, there is a concept called the block universe. Past, present, and future all coexist simultaneously. From that perspective, your entire life already exists as a single structure. You are not moving through time. Your awareness is scanning through a fixed shape. If that's true, then death is not the end of existence. It is the end of traversal. The tutorial does not end because time runs out. It ends because the scan is complete. This reframes anxiety entirely. The fear that you are running out of time may be the system working exactly as intended. Time anxiety is not malfunction, it is motivation. It pushes consciousness to engage rather than drift, which is why boredom feels unbearable here. Boredom is resistance to pacing. It is consciousness rejecting wasted time because, at some level, it knows time matters in this environment. But that urgency may not exist beyond it. If time is a training constraint, then its disappearance would not feel like chaos. It would feel like release. No waiting, no decay, no rushing, no regret. Just awareness, no longer forced to learn through sequence. Which brings us inevitably to the moment when time seems to stop for everyone: death. The point where clocks lose relevance, where schedules dissolve, where the countdown ends. If time is the leash, death is where it unhooks. And that raises the most difficult question yet. If time is what makes lessons possible, what happens when the lesson is over? What if death is not the collapse of consciousness, but the moment the constraints finally fall away? What if the fear surrounding death is not because it ends experience, but because it ends the interface through which you've learned to experience it all? From the outside, death looks like failure. A body stops, a brain goes silent, signals cease. But from the inside, when anyone has ever come close enough to glimpse it, death does not behave like extinction, it behaves like transition. This is not speculation pulled from mysticism alone. Near-death experiences follow patterns too consistent to ignore. Across cultures, belief systems, and historical eras, people report strikingly similar elements. Separation from the body, heightened clarity, panoramic awareness, the collapse of time, an overwhelming sense of understanding, and a life review where events are not merely remembered but felt from every perspective involved. What's disturbing is not that these reports exist. What's disturbing is how coherent they are. Hallucinations fragment, and dreams distort. Brain damage scrambles narrative, yet near-death experiences often produce the opposite effect: hyper-organization, emotional coherence, and a sense of reality more intense than waking life. People do not report confusion. They report lucidity. If the brain were simply shutting down, awareness should degrade. Instead, it sharpens. This suggests something radical, that the brain may not generate consciousness but regulate it, like a valve, not a source. When the valve loosens through trauma, lack of oxygen, or chemical release, awareness expands rather than vanishes. Neuroscience already hints at this. The brain is one of the most energy-consuming organs in the body, yet consciousness occupies a surprisingly small portion of neural activity. Most brain processes happen without awareness, which implies that consciousness is not the brain's primary function, but a controlled output. So what happens when the control system fails? At death, the brain releases a cascade of neurochemicals, endorphins, serotonin, and most notably, DMT, a compound capable of producing experiences of radical transcendence, loss of identity, and contact with realities that feel more real than reality itself. But here's the unsettling part. These experiences do not feel like fantasies. They feel like return. People often say, "It felt like going home. Not forward, not upward, home." If death were annihilation, why would it feel familiar? In every training system there is a final checkpoint, a moment when progress is evaluated, not through judgment, but through integration. The learner is not asked what they memorized, but what they became under pressure. Near-death life reviews are not moral interrogations. They are experiential mirrors. You feel the impact of your actions, not as punishment, but as understanding. Pain you caused is felt. Love you offered is amplified. Intent becomes visible, not to shame, but to clarify. That does not sound like an ending. It sounds like a debrief. And consider this. In these experiences, people rarely report being told new information. They report remembering. The knowledge feels pre-existing, as if awareness is re-accessing something it temporarily forgot. If death were the end, nothing would need to be remembered. So why does death feel like recognition? Perhaps because death is not where consciousness stops, but where identity dissolves. The body ends, the name ends, the story ends. But awareness continues, no longer confined to a single viewpoint. This reframes the terror of death entirely. But if consciousness continues, moral structure becomes essential. Notice how this world constantly tests those structures. You are placed among others with conflicting needs, limited resources, misunderstandings, and pain. You are forced to navigate cooperation, sacrifice, boundaries, and forgiveness under imperfect conditions. You are never given full information. You must choose anyway. That is not random. That is rehearsal. And notice something else. This life does not reward outcomes as much as intent. You can fail while trying to do good and still feel intact. You can succeed through cruelty and still feel hollow. The internal response matters more than the external result, as if the system is measuring not what you achieve, but how you choose to be. Because achievements do not transfer, but patterns of awareness do. If there is a higher environment, it would not ask what you owned, what you built, or how you were seen. It would reveal how you processed uncertainty, how you handled power, how you treated others when there were no guarantees, which makes this life feel less like a test you can pass or fail, and more like a sculpting process. Pressure is applied, responses are observed, structure emerges, and when the form is stable enough, the container is no longer needed. This reframes ambition entirely. Success here may have nothing to do with external milestones. A quiet life lived with awareness could be far more advanced than a loud life driven by ego. A single act of compassion under real cost may shape consciousness more than 1,000 comfortable virtues, because the higher environment would not need performers, it would need stable participants. And stability does not mean rigidity. It means the ability to remain conscious without clinging to form, to exist without needing constant reinforcement of identity, to encounter vastness without fear, which is why death strips everything away, not as punishment, as preparation. You do not cross the threshold carrying titles, stories, or masks. You cross as awareness itself. Whatever is unresolved comes with you. Whatever is integrated stabilizes you. Whatever you avoided becomes unavoidable. So, this life may not be about becoming important. It may be about becoming ready to exist without boundaries, ready to perceive without filters, ready to relate without separation. If that sounds overwhelming, it should. That is why this environment is slow, why growth is incremental, why lessons repeat, why consciousness is given decades instead of moments. The tutorial does not rush graduation. It waits until you can hold more than this world allows. And that leads to a quiet, unsettling realization. If there is a higher existence, then this one is not about escaping. It is about maturing. If death is the doorway, then what kind of reality does it open into? What environment would require an entire lifetime of emotional pressure, moral struggle, and perceptual limitation just to prepare consciousness to enter it? If this life is a tutorial, then what comes after is not simply more life. It is a fundamentally different operating system. Imagine removing the constraints one by one. No fragile body demanding constant maintenance. No senses bottlenecked to survival data. No linear time forcing cause and effect into a narrow tunnel. No identity locked to a single history, culture, or role. What remains is not emptiness, but expansion. Physics already hints at realities far stranger than this one. Extra dimensions curled beyond perception. Non-local connections where distance becomes irrelevant. Information fields that persist even when matter changes form. The deeper science looks, the less solid reality becomes, and the more it resembles a layered structure rather than a single stage. If consciousness survives the tutorial, it would not wake up in a place like this. It would wake up in a reality where awareness itself is the primary medium, where experience is not mediated through flesh, but through direct perception, where knowing is not sequential, but simultaneous. And that is precisely why preparation would be necessary. A consciousness raised in comfort, certainty, and ease would be overwhelmed by such an environment. Infinite awareness without emotional maturity would be chaos. Expanded perception without empathy would be cruelty. Freedom without responsibility would be destruction. So what does this life train? Not intelligence alone. Intelligence without wisdom is dangerous. Not happiness alone. Happiness without depth is fragile. Not obedience, belief, or knowledge. It trains how consciousness relates to complexity. This is why emotions matter so much here. Love, grief, guilt, forgiveness, awe, these are not side effects of biology. They are calibration tools. They teach consciousness how to hold intensity without collapsing, how to remain open without being consumed, how to coexist with other perspectives without dissolving into conflict. In a higher environment, one where consciousness may not be isolated, these traits would not be optional. They would be structural necessities. Imagine a reality where awareness is shared, layered, interconnected, where separation is thinner, where the inner state of one consciousness ripples outward instantly. In such an environment, unresolved fear or hatred would not stay private. It would destabilize the whole system, which means emotional regulation is not just a human concern, it is universal infrastructure. This could explain why morality feels so deeply embedded in consciousness, why guilt persists even when no one is watching, why compassion feels rewarding even when it costs us. These reactions are not culturally arbitrary, they feel intrinsic, as if consciousness itself has preferences about how it wants to exist. If this life were meaningless, moral intuition would be unnecessary. But if consciousness continues, moral structure becomes essential. Notice how this world constantly tests those structures. You are placed among others with conflicting needs, limited resources, misunderstandings, and pain. You are forced to navigate cooperation, sacrifice, boundaries, and forgiveness under imperfect conditions. You are never given full information. You must choose anyway. That is not random. That is rehearsal. And notice something else. This life does not reward outcomes as much as intent. You can fail while trying to do good and still feel intact. You can succeed through cruelty and still feel hollow. The internal response matters more than the external result. As if the system is measuring not what you achieve, but how you choose to be. Because achievements do not transfer, but patterns of awareness do. If there is a higher environment, it would not ask what you owned, what you built, or how you were seen. It would reveal how you processed uncertainty, how you handled power, how you treated others when there were no guarantees. Which makes this life feel less like a test you can pass or fail, and more like a sculpting process. Pressure is applied, responses are observed, structure emerges, and when the form is stable enough, the container is no longer needed. This reframes ambition entirely. Success here may have nothing to do with external milestones. A quiet life lived with awareness could be far more advanced than a loud life driven by ego. A single act of compassion under real cost may shape consciousness more than 1,000 comfortable virtues. Because the higher environment would not need performers, it would need stable participants. And stability does not mean rigidity. It means the ability to remain conscious without clinging to form, to exist without needing constant reinforcement of identity, to encounter vastness without fear, which is why death strips everything away, not as punishment, as preparation. You do not cross the threshold carrying titles, stories, or masks. You cross as awareness itself. Whatever is unresolved comes with you. Whatever is integrated stabilizes you. Whatever you avoided becomes unavoidable. So this life may not be about becoming important. It may be about becoming ready. Ready to exist without boundaries. Ready to perceive without filters. Ready to relate without separation. If that sounds overwhelming, it should. That is why this environment is slow. Why growth is incremental. Why lessons repeat. Why consciousness is given decades instead of moments. The tutorial does not rush graduation. It waits until you can hold more than this world allows. And that leads to a quiet, unsettling realization. If there is a higher existence, then this one is not about escaping. It is about maturing. Why do love, kindness, and meaning feel heavier than logic itself? Why do they linger when facts fade, when memories blur, when even identity begins to loosen? Why does a single moment of genuine connection feel more real than years of routine survival? If this life is a tutorial, then love is not decoration. It is one of the core mechanics. Notice how strange it is that emotions, intangible, invisible, unmeasurable, carry more weight than anything physical. You can lose money and recover. You can lose status and rebuild. You can lose time and rationalize it away. But lose love or betray it or waste it, and something inside you fractures in a way no logic can repair. That alone should tell you something. Evolutionary explanations only go so far. Yes, bonding aids survival. Yes, cooperation increases odds. But those explanations do not account for the depth of emotional gravity. They do not explain why love feels transcendent, why compassion expands awareness, why cruelty corrodes the self, even when it benefits survival. Love does not behave like a survival strategy. It behaves like a structural principle. Think about how love changes perception. When you care deeply, time alters. Attention sharpens. Meaning intensifies. You become capable of sacrifices that logic alone would never justify. Love reorganizes priorities instantly, without needing explanation. It bypasses calculation and moves directly into action. If consciousness were merely a byproduct of biology, this would be inefficient. But if consciousness is being trained for something beyond biology, love begins to look like alignment. In every moment of genuine connection, the sense of separation softens. You feel less isolated inside yourself. Boundaries blur. Another person's joy or pain registers as your own. This is not metaphorical. It is experiential. Love temporarily dissolves the illusion of isolation, which raises a critical question. If the higher environment is less separate than this one, if consciousness there is more interconnected, then love is not optional, it is rehearsal. This world constantly places love under pressure, love tested by loss, love strained by misunderstanding, love challenged by fear, ego, scarcity, and time. Rarely is love allowed to exist in ideal conditions. It must survive uncertainty to deepen. Why? Because superficial love would not survive a reality with fewer boundaries. Only integrated love would. Kindness follows the same pattern. It often costs more than cruelty. It requires restraint when aggression would be easier. It demands awareness when indifference would be comfortable. And yet, kindness feels right in a way success often does not. Why would a meaningless universe reward kindness with inner coherence? It wouldn't. But a training environment would. Kindness stabilizes consciousness. It reduces internal conflict. It aligns intention with action. It creates internal harmony even when external outcomes are uncertain. In systems theory, stability under complexity is the highest achievement. Kindness is not weakness, it is resilience. Meaning works the same way. Humans will endure extraordinary suffering if they believe it serves a purpose. Without meaning, even comfort becomes unbearable. This suggests that consciousness is not designed to optimize pleasure, but to orient towards significance. Meaning is not found, it is constructed under pressure, and that construction appears to matter more than any external reward. This is why lives that look insignificant from the outside can feel complete from the inside, and lives that appear successful can feel hollow. The metric is not achievement, it is coherence. How well does your inner world hold together under reality's weight? If this life were the final destination, meaning would be subjective and disposable. But meaning feels urgent, necessary, as if consciousness itself deteriorates without it, which suggests that meaning is fuel. Fuel for something beyond this environment. Notice how love, kindness, and meaning all share one property. They expand awareness beyond the self. They force consciousness to account for something larger, another person, a future outcome, a value that transcends immediate survival. They train consciousness to hold more than itself. In a higher existence, self-centered awareness would be unstable. Ego would distort perception. Fear would amplify. Without separation, unresolved inner conflict would echo endlessly. Only consciousness capable of coherence beyond the self could function. Which means this life may not be preparing you to know more. It may be preparing you to care better. This reframes morality completely. Ethics are not rules imposed from outside. They are internal calibrations that determine how consciousness behaves when constraints loosen, when there is more freedom, not less. In that context, every choice matters, not because it is judged, but because it shapes the structure of awareness you carry forward. Every moment of empathy strengthens integration. Every act of cruelty introduces fragmentation. Every choice to remain conscious under pressure stabilizes the system. This is not about reward or punishment. It is about compatibility. A higher environment would not accommodate unstable consciousness, not out of judgment, but out of necessity. Just as this world cannot support beings without gravity tolerance or oxygen compatibility, a more interconnected reality would require emotional and perceptual compatibility. Love, kindness, and meaning may be the training weights that build that tolerance. And here is the quiet truth most people sense, but rarely articulate. The moments that feel most real in your life are not the moments you acquired something. They are the moments you connected. If this life is a tutorial, those moments are not distractions from the lesson. They are the lesson. What if the most frightening possibility isn't that life ends, but that some people never truly begin? If this world is a tutorial, then it is not one you can simply exist inside and automatically complete. Presence alone is not progress. Time passing is not the same as learning. And survival, by itself, does not equal advancement. This raises a question that feels uncomfortable precisely because it feels plausible. What if many people repeat this level, not because they are punished, but because they remain unchanged? Look around. Notice how easily life becomes mechanical. Days blur. Routines replace reflection. Distraction fills every quiet moment. Screens numb discomfort before it can teach anything. Pain is avoided, anesthetized, or buried rather than examined. Awareness shrinks to maintenance mode. This is not failure in a dramatic sense. It is something far subtler. It is stagnation. In every training system, there is a way to move through the environment without actually integrating the lesson. You can memorize patterns without understanding them. You can follow rules without insight. You can mimic growth without transformation. From the outside, progress appears to happen. Internally, nothing shifts. If consciousness is being shaped here, then avoidance is not neutral. It delays development. And the most efficient form of avoidance is unconsciousness. Not sleep, but psychological autopilot. Living reactively. Thinking defensively. Feeling selectively. Never sitting long enough with discomfort for it to change you. This is why suffering alone is not enough. Pain can harden as easily as it can deepen. Trauma can collapse awareness instead of expanding it. Loss can close the heart instead of opening it. The lesson is not guaranteed. The tutorial applies pressure. What you do with that pressure is up to you. This reframes the idea of wasted life. It has nothing to do with productivity or achievement. A life is not wasted because it lacked success. It is wasted only if awareness never grew. And awareness does not grow automatically. It requires engagement. It requires looking at yourself honestly when no one is watching. It requires staying present when distraction is available. It requires choosing consciousness over comfort again and again, often quietly, often invisibly. This is why this environment is dangerous in a very specific way. It is easy to survive here without ever waking up. And if the purpose of this life is preparation, then unconscious survival is indistinguishable from non-participation. That idea feels harsh. But training environments are not sentimental. They respond to behavior, not intention. Wanting to grow is not the same as growing. Believing something comforting is not the same as integrating it. What matters is adaptation. And adaptation leaves traces. It shows in how you respond to fear, in how you treat others when nothing forces you to be kind, in whether pain makes you curious or bitter, in whether uncertainty makes you reflective or aggressive. These responses are not moral trophies. They are structural signals. And here is where the idea of repetition quietly enters. If consciousness does not integrate what this environment is designed to teach, why would it advance to an environment that requires those traits to function? Advancement is not reward. It is compatibility. You do not graduate from a tutorial because time ran out. You graduate because the system no longer needs to limit you, which means repetition would not be punishment. It would be continuation, not because you failed, but because you are unfinished. This perspective dissolves both fear and complacency. There is no eternal condemnation here, but there is no automatic progression either. Growth is optional, but consequence is not. The tutorial does not force awakening, it waits for it. And the most unsettling realization is this. Many people sense this intuitively. That is why boredom feels unbearable. That is why meaninglessness hurts more than pain. That is why distraction must be constant. Silence is dangerous because it invites awareness. Deep down, consciousness knows when it is being wasted. This is not about guilt. Guilt paralyzes. Awareness mobilizes. The question is not whether you are good or bad. The question is whether you are present, whether you are actually here, or merely occupying space until time runs out. Because if this life is preparation for something more expansive, then drifting through it half-aware is not neutral. It is missed opportunity. An opportunity, once gone, does not disappear. It waits. So ask yourself, not with fear, but with precision. Are you learning from what happens to you, or are you only reacting to it? Are you becoming more conscious, or just more accustomed? Because if this is a tutorial, then the most important requirement is not belief. It is participation. If this life truly is a tutorial, then the final lesson is not hidden at the edge of the universe or locked behind death. It is already unfolding quietly inside the way you live, the way you choose, the way you pay attention. Because the most unsettling realization is not that something comes after life. It is that this life has been shaping you all along, whether you noticed or not. Nothing here was neutral. Every delay trained patience or resentment. Every loss carved depth or bitterness. Every moment of fear either narrowed you or expanded you. Every moment of love either softened you or terrified you. And none of these outcomes were forced. That is what makes this feel less like fate and more like preparation. You were never pushed down a single path. You were placed inside a pressure field and allowed to respond, again and again, quietly, without supervision, without certainty, without guarantees that your effort meant anything at all. And that uncertainty was essential. If you had known this was training, you might have performed. If you had known consciousness continues, you might have acted strategically. If you had known death was not the end, you might have taken fewer risks, or worse, treated life lightly. Instead, you were asked to live as if this was all there was. That is the only way the lesson works, because only then do your choices become honest. Only then does kindness reveal itself without expectation. Only then does courage appear without reward. Only then does integrity exist without witnesses. A consciousness shaped under those conditions is not theoretical. It is tested. That is why meaning never arrives fully formed. You don't receive it. You construct it under pressure. You assemble it slowly through confusion, disappointment, and quiet realizations that no one else sees. Meaning is not discovered. It is forged. And forged things endure. Look back at your life carefully, not through nostalgia, not through regret, but through structure. Patterns emerge, certain themes repeat, certain challenges circle back in different forms, certain lessons refuse to leave until they are integrated. That is not coincidence. Training systems repeat material until it stabilizes. And stabilization does not mean perfection. It means consistency under stress. You are not here to become flawless. You are here to become coherent, to reach a point where fear no longer dictates your choices, where pain informs but does not dominate, where love is not transactional, where awareness remains intact even when identity is threatened. That level of inner stability cannot be given. It must be lived into existence, which is why this world feels heavy, dense, slow, demanding. Gravity is strong here. Time moves forward relentlessly. Bodies decay, relationships strain. Nothing stays still long enough to feel safe. This is not cruelty. This is resistance, and resistance builds strength. Not physical strength, structural strength. The kind of strength that allows consciousness to hold more reality without fragmenting. If there is a higher existence, and nothing here proves it definitively, but nothing disproves it either, then it would not be gentle. It would be vast, unfiltered, less separated, more intense, a place where inner states matter far more than appearances. Only a consciousness that has learned restraint, empathy, and self-awareness could exist there without causing harm, to itself or to others, which reframes every small moment you thought didn't matter. The moment you chose patience when anger would have been easier, the moment you stayed present instead of escaping into distraction, the moment you admitted you were wrong when your ego resisted, the moment you cared even though it hurt. Those moments were not wasted. They were structural upgrades. And here is the part most people miss. You are not being judged. There is no cosmic scorekeeper tallying sins and virtues. Evaluation, if it exists at all, is internal, automatic, structural, a natural consequence of what you have become. Just as a bridge does not pass or fail judgment, it either holds weight or collapses. Consciousness either stabilizes under expansion or it doesn't, which means there is no punishment here, only readiness. And readiness is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It looks ordinary from the outside. It often feels quiet, humble, incomplete. People who are becoming ready rarely feel special. They feel attentive. They listen more. They react less. They tolerate ambiguity. They do not need constant certainty to function. They begin to sense that life is not asking them to win, but to wake up. If this is a tutorial, then waking up does not mean rejecting the world. It means engaging it more honestly, feeling more deeply without drowning, seeing more clearly without becoming detached. And perhaps the final test is this: can you live fully here, without clinging to here as if it were all there is? Can you care deeply, without fear of loss freezing you? Can you act ethically, without needing cosmic reassurance? Can you face death without demanding answers first? Because whatever comes next, if anything does, will not reward certainty. It will reveal coherence, and coherence is built now, in this life, in this body, in these moments that feel ordinary precisely because they are doing extraordinary work beneath the surface. If this life is a tutorial, then you are not late. You are not behind. You are not failing. You are still inside the lesson. And the lesson is not about knowing what comes next. It is about becoming someone who can step into it without fear when the time comes. Quietly, awake, intact.